Philip, can you just briefly talk about your family history? I mean, it almost seems that your interest in Lincoln is genetically predisposed.
Well, I don't know about genetics, but it was certainly culturally disposed. I grew up in a family that was surrounded by Lincoln's presence, his imagery on our walls, the wonderful bronze statue by Keck by my father's desk. I knew that I was growing up in a Lincoln family, and I got to know it, the roots, pretty early on. My great-grandfather, as you know, is Frederick Hill Meserve, and he was one of the first great collectors of photography in this country. And he lived to such a ripe old age of 96 that I actually intersected with him. I was 12 when he died. So he was living in New York City with his great collection, and my dad would take us in to visit him. And that was where we really came to realize that we came from a line of Lincoln scholarship. He had a 5-story brownstone in New York City, and where he lived for 50 years. And he kept his collection on the 5th floor. No elevators, of course. And so we would walk up these winding stairs to the top. This is my memory as a kid. And that you'd look down the stairwell, and you could look all the way down to the basement, and then look up. And he'd be up there in this inner sanctum, surrounded by his stuff. And it just was a kind of a very cool thing to go visit him. And he was always he loved my father, and so he was very kindly toward him and loved when he brought us to visit him. And anyway, from a very early age, I was aware that I came from a family of great interest in Lincoln, and I didn't think I would necessarily fall into the spell, but I did eventually.
But now he also published a number of books.
Yeah, he did.
On Lincoln photographs.
He did. Well, I'll take you back one step further.
Okay.
Tell you, just remind you, you know the story, Tom, but maybe others don't. His father was a major in the Union Army during the Civil War, and he was wounded at Antietam. He then served under General Grant in the Wilderness Campaign. And interestingly, he was assigned to the city of Washington on the night of April 14th, 1865. He was among the military presence that responded to the word of the assassination. He helped cordon off the city. He met Lincoln briefly on 2 occasions. He kept a diary during his war years, and he later turned it into a full memoir. And when his son got older, he asked his son, "Would you help me illustrate this?" And my great-grandfather, we called him Gampy, he said, "Yeah, I'd like to try to find some photographs that would show the battlefields where you fought on, and maybe some of the officers that you fought alongside, and some of the leading figures on the Confederate side as well, and we can really illustrate this thing." So he began to go looking for photographs wherever you could find them in those days, and there wasn't a lot of collectors of photography then, but he would go to secondhand stores, and he'd go to, he'd hear about private collections of this and that, and he began to assemble them, and he got more and more interested. And there are some classic stories about it, how some early finds that really ignited his interest. He was at an auction house in New York City called Bang's, and he bid 20 cents more than the previous bidder, about $1.20, and he won the bid. And it was a brown paper wrapped bunch of photographs. Nobody knew. They were not declared. The contents were unknown. He took them home, opened them up, and they were 120 salt prints from the 19th century of a wide range of fascinating individuals, Emerson and Lee and Tawney, and it was an extraordinary find, treasure trove, and this really got him going. I won't just go on and on, but there's a series of great discoveries he made that turned him from an amateur collector for his father's book into a lifelong, what Carl Sandburg called the zealot, the great passionate collector of 19th century photography.
Now, I remember when her son was born, the great book dealer Ralph Newman, he and his wife Pat, sent me a little children's book for him called Pat the Bunny. talk about that?
It's funny. Our family is better known for that book than for anything else. That book is still selling all these years later. That book was written by my grandmother, Dorothy Meserve Kunhardt, and she was Gampy's daughter and his great friend and collaborator on many projects and the inheritor of his collection. So if you asked her if she was sitting here, what is your life's work, she would tell you about her Lincoln Scholarship and her work on the collection and some of the books she wrote. But she's best remembered for Pat the Bunny, which is her. What's cool about it is that it was the pretty much the first interactive children's book. I mean, she kind of helped invent that genre. I wouldn't, there may have been other earlier examples of it. I'm not a scholar of that, but it was one of the very earliest ones where kids could actually feel, touch, interact with the book, and the public fell in love with it, and it's been a bestseller ever since it was written. She wrote it when in some tough years in their family when they needed extra income, and she decided, well, why don't I try to write some children's books? And she modeled the kids after her own kids who were about that age. Paul and Judy were the two characters. Paul was named after a nephew, and it's a fun book. But thanks for asking about it.
How did 20 Days come about?
20 Days was my grandmother's oeuvre. I mean, her the capstone of her career, and she did it in collaboration with my dad. And that's where it gets interesting in our family. My father was an English major at Princeton and then afterwards looked for a job as a newspaper writer and couldn't find one, and landed up at Life magazine as a copy boy, and then spent his whole career at Life magazine. And Henry Luce liked him, and he made steady progress, and he eventually became their managing editor. But he had a terrific eye for picture, and he, growing up in this family of historical pictures, but he also had a photojournalist's eye, and knew the power of photographs could convey stories, and how you could find details in them through enlargement and other techniques. And so he had this marvelous storytelling sense, and she had this deep research ability and curiosity and interest in the Lincoln lore. And so they actually combined their talents over a period of time. He was working in the city, she was living in the city, in New York, and he would put in a long work day at Life magazine, and then instead of coming home to Chappaqua where we lived, he would go over to her house, and they would have dinner together, and then they would work through the night, all night long, and have a big pot of coffee in the morning, and he'd go back to work for another full day at Life. And in this way, by working that way once or twice a week in a series of years, they were able to produce this book, 20 Days, which is really again, it was a genre. It was a very innovative book in the sense that it conveyed history in a very photojournalistic way that was very appealing. It's amazing how many people I meet still that tell me that book is what ignited their interest in history. I heard this from David Hackett Fisher, the great Pulitzer Prize-winning biographer of George Washington. He told me that this is the first book that he remembers lying on the floor reading this thing and just getting all fired up. So.
I love that book, and I use it a lot still. Were some of those stories that appeared in Life magazine kind of, again, appear in advance of the finished book? Or, I mean, I noticed that there was a story about, for example, Fleetwood Lindley that appeared in Life magazine.
Yeah. And
that's obviously in the book. Some of the techniques you talked about with kind of zeroing in,
yes,
especially at the second inaugural,
yes,
and Booth and
yeah,
the conspirators, that was a story in Life
yeah,
magazine.
Yeah. And well, what happened was my dad helped his mother arrange for some bylines in the magazine, and she would do stories that sometimes they were, they went on into new, they weren't exactly just from the book, but they would take themes that were either later or earlier in that book, and she would expand on them for these articles. And she did one on Fido, Lincoln's dog,
that's right, yeah,
is very fun. And they just had a great friendship and ability to collaborate, just as she had with her father. And I have to say, just since we're talking on camera, that this great collection of my great-grandfather's, it could have easily broken up entirely at the time of his death, which is 1962. But because my grandmother had 2 siblings, and these things, when they get divided, it's impossible to hold them together. So it was really the generosity of Dorothy's sister Helen and her brother Leighton, who decided that because of her long work with their dad, that she should have the entire collection, and it came to her through their gift, really. So that allowed the collection to stay intact until her death in 1978, and then again, it really did break up at that point and went different ways. There was a big auction of some of her great treasures, and there was the famous sale to the Smithsonian of all the glass negatives that my great-grandfather had discovered, and all the life negatives. But what the cool thing was that over about 30 years, my grandmother gifted much of her collection to my father on a yearly basis, and he was so interested in the paper prints, the carte de visite collection, the cabinet card collection, and the original Gardner war prints, and thousands of paper prints came down to him on a year-by-year basis. So that this is how we've been able to hold this collection together. And then we did the same thing. My brother Peter and I worked with our dad in a similar way that he worked with his mother, and collaborated on numerous projects. And he decided about 15 years before he died that he would start gifting his collection to us. So that's how it's happened.
Now, how did that come about? Because you're an ordained Episcopal minister.
Yes.
Was that the route you were headed toward, or how did you come back into the family enterprise of writing about Lincoln and illustrating Lincoln?
Well, I am an ordained Episcopal minister, and I did that. I made my living that way for a while as a parish minister, and liked it. What happened was that beginning in the late 1980s, my brother Peter, who is a television producer at ABC, was looking to make a change in his life. My father was getting a point. He had retired, but was looking for some late in life work of a satisfying kind. And I was looking for something new, and the 3 of us decided to merge forces and create a company and merge our various interests. My brother's had mostly the television interest. My father had this pictorial photojournalistic talent, as well as being a fine writer. And I had a scholarly bent and was interested in the research and also writing myself. And the 3 of us decided to create a triumvirate, if you will. In 1991, we officially opened Kunhardt Productions.
Now, I remember the Lincoln documentary you did, along with just the wonderful companion volume.
Yeah.
And 6 hours primetime network television right after Christmas. How did you do that?
Well, I don't think it was 6 hours. I think it was. I think it was 3 hours prime time. It was later expanded in a video format for sale, but they wouldn't have given us 6 hours. But it was tough to get that kind of on it's impossible. Network, I know.
Yeah.
It was partly. I have to say, my brother is a genius. He had worked for ABC Television, and this was the network that bought it from us. And it was partly his relationships and the fact that they trusted him so much. But also, you have to give credit to the Burns brothers. Ken and Rick Burns' work on the Civil War had shown the networks that there was a huge audience out there interested in serious history. I don't think they had realized that before, and they were willing to take a chance on, let's see if we can't reach out to that audience.
But you had David Herbert Donald as your chief historical consultant.
We did.
Had his book come out already?
No.
But he was working on it.
He was working on it,
his biography.
Yeah.
You had almost every top Hollywood celebrity as a voice.
Yeah, we did.
Including Oprah Winfrey.
Oprah Winfrey, yeah.
Oh.
And other weird, even stranger choices like Arnold Schwarzenegger was the voice of John G. Nicolay, I remember. And we figured that out, that slight, that German
Yeah.
it was a reach, but it kind of worked.
But just fabulous way of kind of reaching a huge audience.
Yeah.
The book, however, is just glorious. And can you talk a little bit about how did you work the layout? Who selected the images? I assume you did the writing?
I did a lot of the writing. My father was still writing then too. The two of us did most of the writing. And my father, of course, with his Life magazine expertise, he really was in charge of the layout. We had an art director as well, who was very fine. My father would actually draw little sketches. We had a mock-up of the book done in miniature, so that each we call it, if you open a book, the two facing pages together make up what's called a spread. And that in our books, we treat them as a single unit, so that every time you turn the page, you're getting a visual, and you're really thinking about how the text and pictures work together every time you turn the page. Most books don't work that way. They just run their text through and drop pictures in here and there. These are very complicated matters of design, and there's a magazine-like aspect to them. My dad did the original sketches for every page, and that was his.
I mean, I think that's apparent. There's this seamless quality between text and illustration.
Yeah.
And having dealt with publishing houses and authors, they always leave until 2 weeks before they're going to put the book to production.
Right.
They start looking for illustrations.
Yeah, that's right.
And so you're right. For most of these things, it's an afterthought.
Well, we work in two ways, and we talk about this quite self-consciously. For television and books, we write without worrying about picture, and then we try to illustrate the writing with picture. But we also work the other way. We know what the great pictorial treasures are that we want to present, and we let them help drive the story as well, so they influence the creation of text. And only if you have the pictures early on in that process can you have this method. And you're right, most authors don't have that luxury. The pictures are an afterthought.
Now, you've got a companion volume that just came out, as well as a documentary.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little about those?
Well, the new book, Looking for Lincoln, which came out in November, and I'm very happy about. It was mentioned today by Bill Sapphire in the New York Times Book Review, by the way, very favorably, which I was pleased to see. But that book, I sometimes do call it a sequel to the other one. It's the same publisher, Kunhardt. It's the same dimensions of size. So, I mean, one of my dreams is that the two books could come out, be reissued as a double edition, a boxed double edition. I don't know if that'll ever happen, but this one is, in a way, picks up where the last one left off. The Lincoln, an illustrated biography, which we did in '92, really was a biography. It began, well, it followed Lincoln's chronology, 1809, 1865, though it began in a kind of cool way. It began with his sneaking into Washington amidst death threats for his inauguration. And then once we'd kind of grabbed the reader, we went back and dealt with his early years. But it ended in 1865, except we had a little appendix at the end called Aftermath. And in it I remember I wrote that, and it was a kind of a look at how the Lincoln legend came to be and how the memory began to be laid down. And it introduced some of the key characters in that process. It was just a little taste of that. And I remember saying to my dad at the time, this could be expanded into a whole other book. And, that must have been in the back of my mind somewhere. Sure. So when we started, I mean, you remember I came out here some years ago to talk with you about ideas for a book for the bicentennial. And I didn't know which way I was going to go at that point. But after at least a year of exploring different ideas, this came back to me, the idea of picking up the story at the point of the assassination itself, and then going forward 60 years, which is the period of the lifespans of those who had known Lincoln. and following how, the course of how his memory was laid down by those who remembered him. And I just realized that was kind of less worked over terrain. There's some marvelous books, Merrill Peterson's book, Lincoln in American Memory, which I knew and read. There's a guy named Barry Schwartz who's written a book on a similar theme. And in fact, I reached out to both those men, and they became advisors to me early on. They liked the idea of the project, and I'm very pleased to say both of them were very happy with the final result and told me they learned a lot of new things, which was good. So, the new book is a sequel in the sense that it picks up where the last book left off and fulfills that little taste of the aftermath that we gave now 17 years ago.
And you've got an appendix in that. You want to talk a little
in the new book? Yeah, the appendix in this book is, we call it the gallery, and it's an attempt to lay out all the known photographic portraits of Abraham Lincoln in chronological order, and to offer up a proposed new numbering system for them. There's been a variety of numbering systems for these pictures over the years. The first was pioneered by my great-grandfather.
That's right, yes.
And it was for many, many decades, it was the standard. There was others, his friend and sort of student, Lloyd Ostendorf, developed his own system that carried forward the numbering system for another generation. And there have been others as well. But there's a desire I found among scholars for a new one, and with the help of some advisors at the National Portrait Gallery and others, and including yourself, who helped me a great deal. We came up with a new system, which I think is really good. It doesn't link the pictures to any, in a kind of romantic way, to any individual, other than to Lincoln himself. The new system is, instead of an M for Meserve or an O for Ostendorf, uses the letters AL for Abraham Lincoln, and then follows them with the year the photograph was taken, the sitting that was chronologically in that year that it came from, and the number of pictures that were taken within that sitting. And so by looking at the catalog number itself, in one easy look, you get a lot of information about the picture itself, which we think I hope is going to be very useful to those who come after us.
I think it is, and sorely needed. You just received the Order of Lincoln, along with your brother Peter, and I'm just wondering, what does that mean to you personally? And you gave a very moving benediction as well about Lincoln, and if you could just kind of again talk about what Lincoln means in this bicentennial year, or why people should even care. Well, it means a lot to be on that dais with people who have devoted their lives to the study of this great man, and it's I felt very honored, and I think I see the award coming not only to Peter and me, but I see it coming to my dad as well. I could imagine him very proudly sitting there beside me, and to my grandmother and to my great-grandfather. So I think it was a tribute that I have to say goes to the whole family. And I was asked to give the benediction. Tom Johnson asked me if I would. I first wondered whether that was appropriate to wear those kind of two hats in that way. I thought about it for a while, and I said, well, listen, if I can do it my way, I'll be glad to do it. I don't want to do a traditional closing prayer. I don't want it to be partisan. I don't want it to be denominational. I don't want it to be exclusive in any way. And he said, you can do it any way you want. So I was thinking about the meaning of the words benediction, and I was thinking literally it means good words spoken. And I was thinking that something very deep about Lincoln is how he saw words and how to use them. And he treated them, here's a man without education, self-taught, and yet one of the geniuses with the use of the English language in our history. And he used language in a way that I think changed history.
And he had a notion of how words spoken in the right moment could effect change. And that means being willing to wait for that moment, which is part of his genius, I think, was his patience, his willingness not to be swayed by critics on either his left or right flank, his ability to keep focused on his goals, but to bring along people with him, to persuade and to bring the public along with him. This is how he saw his role of leadership. And he did it largely through words. When you think of his great public letters that really did bring the public around on many of his key issues, when you think of the Gettysburg Address, one of his most famous words, or the second inaugural, or the first for that matter, his words literally opened up new possibilities in our history. And I find this one of the most moving things about him. So I talked about that in my benediction, and then I tried to say a few good words of my own to inspire us to, look to the highest good that we can imagine, each of us in our own way, whether we're religious or non-religious, and to recommit ourselves to the common good and to making a better world. So that's basically what I did.
Thank you so much, Phil.
Thank you, Tom.
Congratulations.
Thank you.